The first thing the boatswain said to him was, "You'll be sick by the second swell, Redcoat. Best find a rail to hang over now before the good ones are taken." I was 3 feet away when he said it, coiling a line I had no business touching, and I remember thinking, this is going to be a long voyage. We were not yet out of the harbor. The Royal Yacht Sovereign's Mercy rode at her mooring with the gilded lions on her bow catching the last gray light, and the man the boatswain was mocking stood where the household had told him to stand, at the foot of the quarterdeck ladder, in the red wool tunic, and the tall black bearskin of the King's Guard, white gloves on his rifle, eyes forward, as still as if the deck beneath him were the cobblestones of the palace forecourt, and not a thing that would soon be trying to throw him into the sea. His name was Sergeant Tarn Ediscombe. I knew that much and almost nothing else. I am Corporal Vale Northam, and at the time of this voyage I had served 11 years in the Warden's Foot, 4 of them at the palace gate, and I had been sent aboard the Mercy as the second man of a 2-man guard detail with one simple charge: to stand the King's young cousin's door and the gangway and look the part. Ediscombe was the first man. He was older than me by a dozen years, broad through the shoulder, with a face that gave away exactly nothing. And from the moment we came up the gangway, the sailors of the Mercy had decided what he was. A passenger in a costume, a statue they had to walk around, a land soldier playing dress-up on the water. "He doesn't even sway," one of the topmen said, loud enough to carry, watching Ediscombe ride the gentle harbor lift without bending his knees. "Look at him, locked up like a fence post. First proper sea and he'll snap clean off." The sailors laughed. Ediscombe did not. He did not look at them, did not color, did not so much as tighten his jaw. He stood his post. And I, who was new to the water and already feeling the deck breathe under me in a way I did not like, felt a small hot flush of anger on his behalf that he plainly did not feel for himself. You have to understand what the Sovereign's Mercy was, and who sailed her, to understand the rest. She was the royal household seagoing yacht, a long, beautiful, dangerous thing, 200 feet of polished timber and brass and white canvas, built to carry the family of the House of Karen across the Marin Strait to the summer seat on the Isle of Welk and back. 3 days out, 3 days home, in good weather. The man we were guarding was the Lord Edmund of Karen, a boy of 19, the King's cousin, making his first crossing as a man grown rather than a child in a nurse's care. There were perhaps 40 souls aboard, the boy and his small household, the 2 of us and the ship's company, the master, the boatswain, the helmsman, the topman, the cook, the boys. The ship's company were a tight, proud, weathered crew who had crossed the strait 100 times, and who regarded everyone not of the sea as ballast that talked. And of all the ballast that talked, the redcoat with the rifle and the bearskin was, to them, the most absurd. "Mind the rope, Redcoat," the boatswain said again as we cast off, deliberately routing a line so it would have brushed Ediscombe's polished boot, if Ediscombe had not, without seeming to move at all, shifted his weight half an inch so the line passed clean. The boatswain blinked. He had expected the redcoat to either trip or to step back like a tourist. Ediscombe had done neither. He had read the line the way you read a thing you have known your whole life, and corrected for it before it arrived, and gone on staring at nothing. I noticed it. The boatswain, I think, half noticed it and decided he hadn't. We cleared the harbor mouth into a gray, restless afternoon. The strait was up, not a storm, not yet, but a long, hard, marching swell coming in from the open water, and the Mercy began to climb and fall, in a slow heave that turned my stomach over within the hour. I will not pretend otherwise. I was sick before we lost sight of land. I gripped a stanchion by the boy's door, and I was, to put it plainly, exactly the seasick redcoat the sailors had promised one of us would be. Ediscombe was not. He stood his post at the foot of the quarterdeck ladder through that whole grinding afternoon, riding the heave with a small, unconscious flex of the knees that I had not seen him use in the harbor, his eyes moving. I saw it now that I was watching him instead of my own misery. His eyes moving in a slow, steady sweep that took in the set of the sails, the helmsman at the great spoked wheel above him, the color of the western sky, the way the spray came off the bow. He was not standing on that deck the way a soldier stands on a parade ground. He was standing on it the way a man stands in a room he has lived in. The sailors did not see that. They saw a redcoat who, unlike his sick partner, simply hadn't fallen over yet. "Give him time," the topman said, grinning as he went past with a coil over his shoulder. "Pride goeth, redcoat, pride goeth." It was near sunset when the master came down off the quarterdeck and stopped in front of Ediscombe. Master Holt was the ship's captain in all but the formal name, a square, gray, capable man who answered to no one aboard but the Lord Edmund, and, in matters of the sea, not even to him. He looked Ediscombe up and down the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had been left in a doorway. "You're in my crew's way, soldier," he said. "On my deck, your rifle's worth nothing and your standing about is worth less. If the weather makes up tonight, and it will, I want you and your sick friend below out of the gear, where you can't be swept off and where my men don't have to step around you. The boys' door is below. Guard that. Leave the sea to people who know it." It was not cruel. It was a working man's contempt, which is colder than cruelty because it does not even bother to be personal. Leave the sea to people who know it. Ediscombe looked at him for one long moment, and then he said the only words I heard him say all that first day. "As you wish, Master Holt," he said. "I'll stand where I'm of use." He said it level, with no edge in it at all, and the master grunted and turned away satisfied, having put the costumed land soldier in his place. The topmen who'd heard it laughed quietly among themselves. I helped Ediscombe shift our post below to the narrow passage outside the Lord Edmund's stateroom, swallowing bile the whole way. And there, in the swinging lamplight of that cramped passage, with the sea beginning to hammer the hull in a way that made me grip the bulkhead, I finally asked him the question I'd been holding all day. "Doesn't it land on you at all," I said, "what they say, any of it?" He took off one white glove and pressed his bare palm flat to the curved timber of the hull, the way a man might lay a hand on the flank of a horse he was gentling, and he held it there a moment, feeling something through the wood that I could not feel. "They're not wrong about a redcoat at sea," he said. "Most of the time." And then, almost too quiet to hear over the rising water, "Get what sleep you can, Corporal. It's going to be a hard night." I did not sleep. No one slept. The storm came up out of the southwest in the dead middle of the night, the way the worst ones do, not a gust and then a blow, but a long building roar that climbed and climbed until you could not remember the world ever being quiet. I have stood guard through cannon salutes that shook the palace windows in their frames. I have never in my life heard anything like the sound of the open strait deciding to come apart. The Mercy stopped riding the swell and started fighting it. She would climb a wall of black water with her bow pointed at the sky, hang for one sick heartbeat at the top of it, and then drop the way a man drops through a trapdoor, and slam into the trough with a crash that ran the whole length of her timbers and threw spray clean over the masts. I clung to a ring bolt outside the boys' door and was no use to anyone, but I could see through the open companionway up onto the quarterdeck, and so I saw what happened, and I have never told it the same way twice because no two tellings can hold all of it. I will try to set it down straight. The first thing I understood was that the sailors who had laughed all day were no longer laughing. They were good men at their work. I will say that for them honestly, and they went up the rigging in that screaming dark to fight the canvas down with a courage I could not have matched. But there is a difference between courage and ease, and I could see, even through the spray and the lamplight, that the ease had gone out of them. Master Holt stood braced at the rail of the quarterdeck roaring orders that the wind tore away half-spoken. The boatswain fought his way forward on a lifeline. And at the great wheel, the helmsman, a young, strong, capable man named Caro, the best of them by the master's own word, wrestled the spokes with both arms locked, trying to keep the Mercy's bow into the seas, because a ship that takes those seas on her side does not climb them. She rolls under them. Ediscombe had come up. I do not know exactly when. He should have been below at the boy's door with me. That was the master's order, that was the post. But the Lord Edmund, white-faced and brave, had wedged himself into the corner of his bunk and called through the door. "I am well, Sergeant. Go where you are needed, in God's name." And Ediscombe, who I think had been waiting all day for exactly that release, had gone up the companionway into the storm. When I saw him, he was on the quarterdeck, braced at the head of the ladder out of the crew's way as he'd been told, soaked through, the bearskin gone, his bare head streaming, watching the helmsman fight the wheel with that same slow, steady sweep of the eyes, and now I understood, watching him watch, that he was not afraid. Every other man on that deck was wearing the fear in his shoulders, even the brave ones. Ediscombe was wearing something else. He was wearing the look of a man reading a page he has read 1,000 times and finding, with grim recognition, that it says exactly what he feared it would. He shouted something to Master Holt. I could not hear it. I saw Holt turn, saw him shake his head once, sharp, contemptuous even now, leave the sea to people who know it, and turn back to his ship. Then the wave came that nearly ended us. I have spoken to 2 of the topmen since, and they agree it was the largest of the night, a single black mountain that came at the Mercy out of the dark on her bow quarter, higher than the others and steeper, the kind the old sailors call a graybeard. Caro saw it and threw his whole body against the wheel to bring the bow up to meet it. The ship began to climb, and at the very worst instant, at the steepest of that climb, with the whole weight of the Mercy hanging on the helmsman's arms and the rudder, there was a sound from below the quarterdeck that I felt in my teeth before I heard it, a deep, splitting crack, sharp as a snapped mast. That was not the storm. The wheel went slack. I saw it happen. I saw Caro, who had been straining against the full live resistance of the rudder, suddenly meet no resistance at all, so that the wheel spun free and fast under his hands and flung him hard against the binnacle. The steering gear had carried away, a tiller chain or a block or a fitting deep in the ship's stern, some single iron thing that all the rest depended on, had let go under the strain of that climb. I learned the particulars later. In the moment, all I knew, all anyone knew, was that the Mercy was halfway up a wall of black water with her bow swinging off the wind, and nothing, connecting the man at the wheel to the rudder that pointed her. A ship that loses her steering at the top of a graybeard does one thing. She falls off. Her bow swings away down the face of the wave, and she comes around broadside, and the next sea takes her on the flank and rolls her over, and 40 souls go into a black sea that does not give anyone back. I knew none of the seamanship of it. But I knew, the way you know a held breath, that we had perhaps a minute to live, and that the men who knew the sea, the men who had earned the right to sneer at us all day, had gone in that instant perfectly, fatally still. Master Holt was shouting for the relieving tackle, for hands to the stern, for a thing that takes long minutes to rig, and that we did not have long minutes for. Caro hauled himself up off the binnacle and seized the dead wheel and spun it, and it spun like a child's toy, connected to nothing. And his face when he understood, that is a thing I will carry to my grave. And Ediscombe moved. He did not run. I want that understood, because everything else about that night was chaos and his part in it was not. He crossed the heaving quarterdeck in 4 long brace strides, timed to the roll, his hand finding 3 separate holds without his eyes leaving the binnacle, and he reached the helmsman's side and put his mouth to Caro's ear and said one short thing. I could not hear it. But I saw Caro's head come up, and I saw the question in the young man's face, "Who are you two?" And then I saw the question die, because there is a way a man speaks about a ship that another man of the sea cannot mistake, and whatever Ediscombe had said in those few words, it had carried his whole credentials in it. "Below," Ediscombe roared then, and this I heard, because for the first time all voyage he had let his voice all the way out, and it cut through the storm like a blade through canvas, a quarterdeck voice, a voice built for exactly this weather. "Master Holt, Tiller flat, the stern, the emergency tiller, the spare bar, is it shipped? Is the emergency tiller shipped? And Master Holt, the gray, capable master who had told the land soldier to leave the sea to people who knew it, turned and stared at the redcoat as if the deck itself had spoken. "It's stowed," he shouted back. "Below in the lazarette it's never." "Then ship it." Ediscombe was already moving as he said it, already at the dead wheel, already taking the spinning spokes out of Caro's hands. "2 men to the lazarette. Ship the tiller on the rudder head now, and you helmsman, stay by me and tell those men below what I tell you, word for word, because they cannot hear me and they will steer her by hand on my call until the gear is rigged. Move." For one heartbeat nobody moved. The land soldier had given orders on the master's own deck, in the master's own weather, and the whole ship hung on whether the master would let it stand. Master Holt looked at the swinging bow and the black mountain rising on the quarter and the redcoat's eyes, and he made the only decision a great seaman could make. He chose the ship over his pride. "Do as he says," Holt bellowed. "Every word do as he says." What happened in the next quarter of an hour I have tried, in the years since, to describe to men who have never been to sea, and I have always failed, because the thing that saved us was not a single brave act that you could point to. It was 100 small right decisions made one after another in the dark with no margin for a single wrong one, by a man who had told me only hours before that they were not wrong about a redcoat at sea, most of the time. The emergency tiller is a heavy timber bar that ships straight onto the head of the rudder, deep in the stern of the vessel, in a foul cramped space where 2 men can stand and haul on it by main strength when the wheel and its chains have failed. It steers the ship the way the very first ships were steered, by muscle directly, with no gearing and no mechanical advantage, every wave's full force coming up the rudder and into the men's arms. But the men in the lazarette could see nothing. They could not see the seas. They could only haul the bar to port or starboard as they were told, and so the ship could only be steered by a voice, by one man on deck who could read the water and call the helm, and a chain of voices to carry his call down into the dark to the men on the bar. Ediscombe was that man. He stood at the head of the ladder where he could see the whole black field of the storm, and he became, in those minutes, the most still and the most alive thing I have ever watched. He read the seas coming the way the boatswain read a coiled line before they arrived. He did not shout in a panic. He called the helm in a steady, carrying, unhurried rhythm, each order short enough to be relayed in the second it took the wave to close, his timing built into the calls themselves. Meet her, starboard the bar, hard, hold it, and Caro at his shoulder screamed it down the companionway to the man in the passage, who screamed it to the man at the hatch, who screamed it into the lazarette, and 3 decks down 2 sailors threw their backs against the timber bar, and slowly, against the black water, the Mercy's bow came back up to meet the graybeard that would have killed us. We climbed it. I felt the deck go up and up under me, sick and endless, and I waited for the slam and the roll that would finish us. And instead the bow came over the crest clean, into the howling air at the top, and dropped down the far side stern first into the trough with a crash that flung me off my feet but did not roll her. She had taken the worst sea of the night straight on, by hand, by voice, and she had lived. Ease the bar amidships, meet the next one, it's running long. Give her time, Ediscombe never stopped. He did not celebrate the wave we'd survived. He was already 3 waves ahead of it, reading the procession of black mountains coming at us out of the dark, and calling each one before it arrived, holding the ship's bow into the storm by a thread of nothing but his own eye and his own voice, and the strength of 2 men he could not see. The sailors who had laughed at the fence-post redcoat all day were now, every one of them, working to his word, and working better for it, because there is a thing that happens to frightened men when one voice among them is not frightened. They steadied. The boatswain got a lifeline rigged forward and never once questioned who was conning the ship. Master Holt stood 3 feet from Ediscombe with his hand on the rail and his face like stone, and he did not take the deck back. He had the wit to know he was watching something he could not do, and the greatness to let it happen. I worked my way up the companionway a little. I could not help it. I had to see, and I crouched in the lee of the deckhouse where the spray could not quite reach, and I watched the redcoat steer the King's yacht through the teeth of the worst storm in 20 years with his bare head streaming and his ruined red tunic plastered to his back. And I understood, all at once and far too late to have done him any good with it, exactly who I had been standing beside all day. This was not a soldier who had learned a little of the sea. This was a seaman. A seaman to the marrow, a seaman the way the master was a seaman and more. A man who knew the rudder and the trim, and the run of the seas the way I knew the weight of a rifle in my own hands. And he had stood at the foot of that ladder all day, and let 40 men decide he was a costume, and had not said one word to correct them. The men on the emergency tiller could not hold it forever. No 2 men can. Steering a 200-foot ship by raw muscle through a graybeard sea is work that breaks arms and tears shoulders. And after the first frantic minutes Ediscombe began calling for reliefs, fresh men down to the bar in pairs. The spent ones hauled up gasping, managing not just the ship but the men who steered her, spending their strength carefully, the way a careful officer spends his soldiers, never letting the bar go untended for the half-second that would let the bow fall off. 4-man relief on the bar from here, he called to Holt between seas, level as a man discussing the watch bill. 2 haul, 2 rest, swap on my word they'll last the night that way and not one of them pass the night. Get me your 2 strongest first. We are not out of this. And we were not. We had survived the broken wheel, but a ship steered by hand on a relayed voice cannot fight a storm forever, and the storm, when I looked west, showed not the faintest sign of breaking. We had hours of black water still to cross before any dawn. The relief had bought us minutes, not safety. And as Ediscombe called the next sea, and the next, holding us alive 1 wave at a time, I saw Master Holt lean in close to him at last, the master who had ordered him below, and shout the question that the whole ship was now silently asking. "Who are you?" Ediscombe did not take his eyes off the water. "Later, master," he said. "Mind your ship now. Here comes a bad one, port the bar, port hard, meet her, hold." So the night went, hour upon hour. I cannot tell it wave by wave. No man could, and no man would want to. I can tell it the way you remember a fever, in long grinding stretches, and a few hard bright moments that stand up out of the dark. I made myself useful at last. There is no shame in being sick on your first sea, Ediscombe told me much later, only in staying sick when there's work. And there was work. The chain of voices that carried his calls down to the men on the bar needed bodies, and a body that can shout a word straight is worth as much in that moment as a body that can haul a rope. So I took my place on the companionway ladder, halfway down into the dark, and I became one link in the line, Caro at the top by Ediscombe, me below him, a sailor below me, the hatchman below him, the men on the bar below all of us. And I learned to scream port, hard, hold, without a half-second's hesitation, and without ever once letting a wrong word out, because a wrong word at the wrong wave was 40 lives. I have stood many posts. I have never stood a harder one than that ladder, screaming another man's orders down into the black with my own death, and everyone else's hanging on whether I got each word exactly right. And the strangest thing, the thing I have never been able to make a landsman understand, is that it was not terror after the first hour. It became something almost like peace, because the voice at the top of the line never wavered, never sped up, never panicked, never went silent at the wrong moment. Ediscombe held us all inside the steadiness of his own voice, the way a strong post holds a vine, and as long as that voice kept calling the seas in its level, unhurried, carrying rhythm, no man in that line could quite believe we were going to die. We were too busy doing the next right thing he'd told us to do. The first hard, bright moment came perhaps 2 hours in, when the bar itself nearly beat us. A graybeard caught the rudder wrong. Even Ediscombe could not call every sea perfectly. No man living could. And one cross sea slammed the rudder over with a force no two men's arms could hold. The bar kicked. Down in the lazarette it threw both men off it, and one of them, a big topman named Sull, was flung against the ship's frames and broke his arm clean. I heard the cry come up the line. For one terrible instant the bar was loose and the bow began to fall off, the ship beginning her fatal swing, and I felt it in the deck, the wrong sickening sideways lean of a ship coming broadside to the sea. And Ediscombe's voice did not change. Bars loose, second pair on it. Throw your weight to starboard, all of it, now Caro, hard down the line, starboard, throw her, calm as a man calling a drill. And the words went down the line in under a second, and the second pair of men, who he had kept resting for exactly this, hurled themselves onto the kicking bar and dragged it back. And the bow came up out of its fatal lean, a heartbeat before the next sea would have taken us on the side. He had kept a reserve. He had spent the men carefully all night precisely, so that when the bar broke loose there would be fresh arms a half-second away. And there were, and we lived. They hauled Sull up the companionway past me, gray and gasping, his arm wrong. There was no surgeon aboard worth the name. The boy's physician was a gentle old man good for fevers and gout, no more, and the broken topman was carried down to the wardroom while the ship fought on without him. I heard later what happened there, and it is part of this story too, so I will set it down. Ediscombe could not leave the deck. He knew it. The ship would have fallen off and died in the minute he was gone. But between seas he called down a relay of instructions to the old physician, how to splint the arm, what to bind, how to lay the man so the ship's motion would not work the break. Short, exact. The orders of a man who had set broken bones at sea before, more than one, more than 10. The physician followed them word for word, and Sull's arm was saved straight, and Sull himself told me, weeks afterward in a dry tavern with his arm near mended, that the redcoat had set his bone by remote order while steering the ship through a storm, and that he, Sull, had spent the whole first day calling that same redcoat a fence post, and that he did not expect to forgive himself for it soon. The second hard bright moment came near the worst of the night, when even Ediscombe's strength began to show its edge. A man cannot con a ship by voice through a storm for hours without paying for it. I could hear it at last, in the small spaces between his calls, a roughness coming into the carrying voice, a half-second's longer pause before each order while he found the next sea. He had been on his feet, braced and soaked and shouting against a full gale, for the better part of the night, reading every wave for 40 lives, and he was a man past 50, and he was reaching the end of what even he had. Caro saw it before I did. "Sergeant," the young helmsman shouted, "let me con her, tell me how, I'll watch the seas, you rest your voice." "No," Ediscombe said, not unkind, just final. "You'll learn it, Caro, and you'll be a master at it one day, and it won't be tonight. Tonight you carry my call and you carry it true. Stay on me." And then lower, just to the helmsman, but I was close enough on the ladder to hear it. "I have done longer nights than this one, lad. Not many, but this one I can finish." And he did. God knows how, but he did. He found something past the end of himself. That thing the best of them always seemed to have one more measure of than the rest of us. And he held the Mercy's bow into the sea, wave after wave after wave, through the blackest hours of that night, until the first gray crack of dawn showed in the east, and the storm, having failed to take us, at last began to tire of trying. The seas came down slowly, the way they always do, grudging, sullen, taking back the night an hour at a time. The graybeards stopped coming. The wind dropped from a scream to a roar to a hard, steady blow, and the Mercy, who had been fighting for her life since midnight, settled at last into a heavy, exhausted, living roll. Below, the men got the relieving tackle properly rigged at last, the gear that takes long minutes to set, the minutes we had not had at midnight and had bought, one wave at a time, with Ediscombe's voice, and the ship could be steered, roughly but safely, by tackle on the rudder head while the broken wheel hung dead above. We were not yet safe. but we were no longer dying, and there is a wider gulf between those two things than any landsman knows. It was full gray daylight before Ediscombe stopped calling the seas. He had been on his feet at the head of that ladder for I do not know how many hours. When the master finally took back the con, gently, almost humbly, with the words, "I have her, Sergeant. The tackle will hold her now. You've brought us out of it," Ediscombe did not collapse, though I think a lesser man would have, and I half wanted him to because there would have been no shame in it. He simply stopped. He came down off the high brace stance he'd held all night, and for one moment he stood swaying with the ship's roll on the streaming deck, his bare gray head bowed, his ruined red tunic black with seawater, his white gloves long since gone, his bare hands locked half open from the cold and the gripping, and he breathed. Just breathed. The way a man breathes who has been holding more than his own life in his two hands and has, against the odds, set it down whole. And the crew of the Sovereign's Mercy stood and looked at him. There was no cheering. I have read accounts of such moments that put a great cheer in them, and perhaps on some ships there would have been. There was none on ours. These were proud men who had spent a whole day deciding that this man was a fool in a costume, and who had spent a whole night being saved by him, and they were too full of what that meant to make any noise at all. The boatswain, who had told him he'd be sick by the second swell, stood by the rail with his cap off in the gray dawn light, turning it in his hands, looking at the redcoat as if at a stranger who had been wearing his neighbor's face. Caro, the helmsman, sat down hard on the deck with his back against the binnacle and put his head in his hands, and I do not think it was only weariness. The topmen stood about in their soaked exhaustion, and not one of them would meet another man's eye, because each of them was busy with the same private accounting, the one Sol would put into words for me later. I called that man a fence post, and he set my bone by voice while he held us off the rocks. What kind of man does that make me? It was Master Holt who finally crossed the deck to him. The gray, square, capable master, who had told the land soldier to leave the sea to people who knew it, walked up to Ediscombe in the dawn and stood in front of him as he had stood in front of him the evening before, but everything in the way the man held himself was changed. He did not look him up and down this time. He looked him in the face, and the question he had shouted into the storm, "Who are you?" he asked again now, quiet, in the gray light, in a voice gone rough. "I'll ask you plain, Sergeant," Holt said. "There is no one alive who learns the sea the way I just watched you take her, who learns that and then puts on a soldier's coat and stands at the foot of a ladder and lets a deck full of fools call him a costume. I have crossed this strait 200 times, and I could not have done what you did at that wheel last night. So I will ask you once, on my own deck, and you'll forgive an old man for asking it. Who are you?" For a long moment Ediscombe said nothing. He looked out at the falling gray seas, the way he had looked at them all night, and something moved in that closed, weathered face that I had not seen before and did not see again, some old grief, long folded up and put away, brought up briefly into the daylight. "I was a king's helmsman once," he said at last, "before your time on this strait, Master Holt, and before mine in this coat." And then quietly, with no pride in it at all, he told us. Not a boast, a confession almost, drawn out of him by the night, by the men's faces, by the simple debt that they were owed the truth. He had been a master's mate and then a master's helmsman in the old king's navy, on the deep-water ships, the long-voyage ships, in the years before any man aboard the Mercy had been at sea. He had brought ships through weather that made our graybeards look like a mill-pond. He had been, in the plain words of the old commission that the household later confirmed, and that hangs now, I am told, in a glass frame in a place of honor. He had been one of the king's own helmsmen, decorated by the old king's own hand for bringing a foundering ship, and 300 souls through a hurricane into harbor when every other man aboard had given them up for lost. A naval hero, in the truest and least comfortable sense of that worn-out word. A man who had done, on a black night long ago, exactly what he had just done for us, and had been honored for it, and had never once spoken of it. And then, Holt said very low, "And then a man gets old for the deep-water ships," Ediscombe said simply. The sea's a young man's trade out there. They put me ashore with my decoration and my thanks as they should have. And the household of the house of Karen, which honors its old servants, found a place for an old helmsman who could still stand straight, a place on land, at a gate, in a red coat. A quiet post for the back end of a long service. A ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile. I have stood that gate 4 years and been glad of it. I did not think the sea would ask anything of me again. When they sent me aboard to guard the Lord Edmund's door, I thought, well, I thought I would stand at the foot of a ladder and let young men who did not know me sail the ship, and that would be right and proper because the ship was theirs and the skill in their hands was fresh and mine was 40 years stale. He looked at the master then, levelly. Most of the time, Master Holt, they were not wrong about me. A red coat is no use at sea. I'd not have taken your wheel for any storm short of the one we had. But last night the sea asked, and an old helmsman does not pretend he cannot hear it. The silence after that lasted a long time. It was Caro who broke it, the young helmsman, getting to his feet, crossing the deck unsteadily, and stopping in front of Ediscombe with his face naked and open the way only a very young man's can be. You said one thing to me, Caro said. When you came to the wheel, before I'd let go, you put your mouth to my ear and you said one thing and I let you take her. Do you remember what you said? I remember, Ediscombe said. You said, son, I have steered worse seas than this in worse ships with better men than me already drowned, and I am not going to let you lose her tonight. Caro's voice cracked on it. And I believed you. I don't know why. A redcoat I'd laughed at all day and the ship dying under my hands, and I heard you say that and I believed you with my whole life. And you were right, he swallowed. I'm sorry, Sergeant, for yesterday, for all of it. Don't, Ediscombe said gently. He put one of his ruined, stiff, bare hands on the young man's shoulder, the first time all voyage I had seen him touch another man. You held my call true all night, every word of it with your friends' lives on your tongue, and you never let one wrong word out. There's nothing to be sorry for in a man like that. You'll be a master helmsman one day, Caro, and a better one than I was, and when some old fool in a strange coat is no use on your deck, you remember last night before you decide what a man is by the cut of his coat. That's all. That's the only debt. Now go and rest. You've earned it more than I have. I have stood many places in my service, and seen many things, but I do not think I have ever seen a thing so quietly large as that young helmsman standing on the dawn deck being forgiven a debt he could not pay, by the man he owed it to. We made the Isle of Welk that afternoon under jury steering and a clearing sky, the Mercy limping into the lee of the island like a beaten but living thing, and there is nothing in the world quite like the smell of land and the stillness of sheltered water after a night like that one. The Lord Edmund came up on deck as we came in, pale and steady, a 19-year-old who had spent his first storm wedged in a bunk listening to the ship try to die around him, and had not once cried out. And the first thing he did, before he spoke to the master, before he spoke to anyone, was to cross the deck to Ediscombe and take the old helmsman's stiff bare hand in both of his and hold it. My cousin the king set you to guard my door, Sergeant, the boy said, in the careful formal way of a young man reaching for words too large for him. I am told you guarded a good deal more than that. I am told you guarded all of us, the whole night, from a thing the men of the sea could not. I do not have words enough. But I am going to find them when I am home, and I am going to make my cousin hear them. You have my word on it. And he kept his word. That is the part the men of the Mercy speak of still, the ones who are left. When the boy came home, he told the tale at the king's own table, and he told it plain, the broken wheel, the knight, the redcoat at the foot of the ladder who turned out to be a king's helmsman, the ship steered through a graybeard sea by one steady voice in the dark. The old commission was found in the archives, and the decoration confirmed, and the king of the house of Karen sent for Sergeant Tarn Ediscombe and stood him in the great hall before the whole court and thanked him, by name, for 2 services 40 years apart, and there was talk of a captaincy, of a ship, of restoring an old hero to the deep water he had been put ashore from. Ediscum declined it, gently, as he did everything, but he declined it. "I am too old for the deep water, Majesty," he said. "I had it from the chamberlain who was in the hall, and I have a gait I am fond of. But I am grateful past speaking that the sea gave me one more night to be of use. A man does not often get to find out so late that the old skill is still in his hands. Let me go back to my post. That is reward enough for any soldier." So he did. He went back to the gate, to the red coat and the quiet post at the back end of a long service, and he stood it the same as he had always stood it. And to the tourists who filmed him and the children who tried to make him laugh, he was exactly what he had always been, a still man in a tall hat who did not move. None of them knew. He never told them. He never told anyone, in all the years I knew him after, unless the sea itself came up in the talk. And even then he would only say that he had been a helmsman once, a long time ago, and let it go. But I knew, and the men of the Sovereign's mercy knew. And every one of those proud sailors who had spent a day calling him a fence post spent the rest of his life telling the tale the other way, of the redcoat they had mocked, the land soldier they had ordered below, who had taken the wheel of a dying ship in the worst storm in 20 years, and brought 40 souls home alive by nothing but his eye and his voice, and a strength that did not quit. The boatswain who told him he'd be sick by the second swell named his own son for him. Caro made master helmsman of the Mercy in time, exactly as Ediscum had said he would, and I am told that on the day he took the wheel for good he said to his new crew that the first thing any helmsman of his would learn was that you never, ever decide what a man is by the cut of his coat, because the most dangerous water he ever crossed had been crossed for him by a man everyone had agreed was nothing at all. I stood beside Sergeant Ediscum at the palace gate for 2 more years after that voyage, until he was at last too old even for the gate, and we never once spoke of the night on the Mercy. There was no need. But I would look at him sometimes, on the quiet gray mornings when the tourists were thin and the forecourt was still. The broad old shoulders, the closed weathered face, the eyes forward, that small unconscious flex of the knee that I now knew was the habit of a man who had spent his youth on heaving decks and never quite lost it. And I would think about how easy it is to look at a still man and decide he is empty. How a deck full of capable men, men of real skill and real courage, can look at a quiet figure standing exactly where he was told to stand, asking nothing, correcting no one, and agree among themselves that there is nothing there. And how wrong they can be. How the quietest man at the foot of the ladder can be the only one aboard who knows the way home, and how he will stand there, taking the laughter, asking for nothing, waiting in perfect stillness for the one black hour when the sea finally asks him the only question he was ever truly built to answer. That is the thing I carried off the Sovereign's Mercy and have never set down. Not the storm, not even the man, just that. The deep, hard-won respect for what you cannot see in a man who has decided to be still. I have never again, in all my years of service, made the mistake of believing that a quiet post means a small one, or that the man standing it has nothing in his hands.